Hi folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python. This is week number 49, and it's the second week where we're talking about how to build a user interface. Now this isn't Python, this is going to be using JavaScript, HTML, and framework functionality that comes from Facebook, Google, and others. The general design, as I've mentioned before, is that there will be a service that is running that serves up the web page structure, the main parts of this, and the other screens as well. And there we will be getting the actual data that fills in and populates these tables that you see here from our Quokka server, which we built using REST APIs on top of Flask and has a database in the back end, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we'll be talking about. We will be going through how an application is structured. We'll be looking in this IDE. I'm using Visual Studio Code. We'll be looking from the index down to the main components that I've built that create this user interface. Those would be the dashboard app bar, and then these three representing devices, services, and hosts that you see right here. And so I'll be talking about how all the magic works, how you get data from our Flask server, etc. Hopefully it will make sense. This is going to be a pretty long lesson, so hang on to your hats if you wear hats. And yeah, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started looking at the code that makes user interface stuff like this actually happen. Now, before we begin, I need to give you a little bit of background about me so you know what to expect in this lesson. I have been writing software in languages such as Pascal and C and C++ and Java, and most recently Python, to implement protocols, to implement user interfaces, to implement middleware, to implement all kinds of stuff over my many decades of writing software. What I haven't done is written software to run in a browser, at least not the current incarnation of the way that we do it, which is with frameworks and JavaScript and HTML and CSS and the like. I have done it enough to create the user interface stuff that you see here, the stuff that if you've looked at Quokka, which has a little bit more functionality, the things like that. I have learned enough in the last half a year to allow me to do this. Now, the time that it took me to do it is relatively short, but what I'm telling you is that I'm a fellow traveler along this path of attempting to learn how to write browser-based software. And for our purposes, we'll be using React. There are other frameworks out there such as Angular, etc., but the stuff that we will be learning is very much related to the usage of HTML and JavaScript in a React framework. And I wanted to tell you, and the point that I'm trying to make is that I too am a novice. So when you see what I've done, I don't want you to take it as the gospel, the way to do it. What I've attempted to do is follow patterns and recommendations from the folks that created React and the folks that created Material UI, and people online who recommend ways to do things in JavaScript and HTML and the like. But I am not an expert by any means. So take what I tell you with a little bit of a grain of salt, but understanding that I do have a lot of background in creating user interfaces, just not using these mechanisms. And so with that disclaimer at the beginning, hopefully that's not too big, let's get started talking about how I built this. All right, let's dive into the code. And now the first thing I'm going to do is close all of these because I know you'll be tempted to look at the code while I'm talking, and I'm kind of narcissistic in that way. I'd like to have you listening to what I'm saying. Now, before we dive in, and I'm going to even close this so you can't look at that. Before we dive in, I want you to notice one thing. Well, you can notice I am using Visual Studio Code. Remember I mentioned before that I had used WebStorm. You can still see it over here. I had to pay money to get that. There's not a free version. That's what I used to write this stuff because a lot of the hotkeys and the behavior, etc., was exactly the same as PyCharm, and I'd gotten used to PyCharm in the last year, so I went ahead and did that. Since I want to support you guys in your situation where you probably don't want to be spending extra money to do this, and I'm 100% in agreement with you on that, I investigated some of the free IDEs for JavaScript, writing JavaScript, and I found a number of them. As I mentioned last time, one that I decided to pull out was Visual Studio Code from Microsoft. It's free. I looked at it. It seems pretty good, so that is what I'm using. I don't know the hotkeys all that well, but it was customizable enough for me that I enjoyed it. So it may be one that you may want to do. I tried Komodo also. That had a really cool name. Sorry, I'm kind of vain that way. I thought it would be really cool to be working on an editor called Komodo. It didn't meet up to my expectations, probably my own fault, but so I ended up here. Anyway, this is my M09 UI. If you go out to the repository for 52 Weeks of Python, you should see it out there. I made some edits this morning. I haven't updated that just yet, but I will shortly. So by the time you watch this, probably it will have been updated maybe multiple times. What you will see in this directory is basically the stuff that was in Quokka UI in my Quokka project, but it's been trimmed down. So I've gotten rid of some stuff. Now, this will also bear some similarity to what you have if you've done the Create React app. It will have created stuff for you like package lock, or README. It will have created this directory structure. I think .idea is from my PyCharm looking at this, and so you can ignore that. Node modules, what's in there? Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. I could scroll down here and my finger would get tired before we got to the bottom. There's a ton of code that we're getting for free with React. So that is a lot of the Node stuff that's contributed by the React framework. There's some stuff here under public, and then there's stuff under source. This is where we keep our JavaScript and HTML type code. So that is what we're looking at right here. So under source, you'll see a couple things. Number one, you will see that I have index.js just like we did in our Create React app. I'm going to open that here. It's pretty much the same. The difference is that I have this thing called dashboard. So I'm not referencing app. I'm referencing something called dashboard. And if you look at where dashboard is, you can see that it's importing dashboard from /components/dashboard. If I open up components here, you would expect to find dashboard, and sure enough, here it is. So I've been poking around at it, but this is what my dashboard looks like. You will look here and say, oh, look, there's some other stuff in here that if I'm just looking at it as a human, that maybe this is referencing something. There's a capital D devices, and there's a capital D devices there. Now, I'm trying to remember, in PyCharm I did Control B. I believe here I do Control F12 in order to take me to devices. Maybe I have to click on it first, or maybe I'm doing it wrong. No, there I do F12 and it took me to devices. Here's my devices. I'm just going to double click on these. There's hosts, and here is services. I don't know why I still have util here. I don't think I use util, so maybe I will have cleaned it up by the time you will look at it. Basically, what I want to say is that this is all the stuff that we have modified. So the only things you have to really worry about here are going to be index.js. That's the thing that we looked at. It references dashboard. Dashboard we look at. Dashboard references popping up devices or hosts or services. And here we have hosts and services. Did I not pop up devices? There's devices, hosts, and services. These are the only files that we need. Oh yeah, one more. I forgot. There's the dashboard app, not the ashboard app. That's a spoonerism. So the dashboard app. So those are the files that I am dealing with and will walk you through. Now, the thing that I want you to be aware of, one of the things that I want you to be aware of is this particular layout. You'll notice that it's pretty much the same for each of these displays. So each of these user interface layouts is going to be fundamentally the same, and so that's very simple. It makes it easy for us to understand. The dashboard is this entire thing, so I just called it the dashboard. It's historical because the first thing that I created when I was doing Quokka was I did a thing that I called the dashboard. It's really the main canvas or palette or whatever, the thing that everything lives on. And there's going to be two parts to it. The top part is going to be the app bar. That's what I call the dashboard app bar. That's this thing up here. It has the name, and it has a button for devices and a button for hosts and a button for services. And then below that is a grid into which I put something called a material table. So it's a table. It's JavaScript table component that somebody built that I'm utilizing. As we looked at before, it allows me to do sorting and it allows me to do searching. So it has a lot of, and it allows me to do pagination. So all of these good things that come with it are handy, and that's why I did that. So it's a pretty simple user interface. That's all that we're doing, and it's the same for devices as well as for hosts as well as for services. There's going to be, the whole thing is, you can think of it as the dashboard. We'll hardly ever deal with that. The app bar is the thing that has these buttons in it and causes what's below it to be rendered, and the thing that's below it is going to be either devices or hosts or services. So that's a general overview looking at this, at what is going to be happening and what we're going to be looking at when we look at the code. So here we are at some of the code, and I want to point something out as we begin. I have intentionally created my Visual Studio Code window to be in this position so that you can see two things. Number one, this is actually our npm start. This is the Node.js service that's running. I'll stop this and then I'll start it again so you can see. You just do npm start like we did with create React app. What that's going to do is it's going to pop up a new window that will be showing my Quokka running. We could be dealing with this one if we wanted to, but I'll go ahead and close that so we can look at this one, and you can see that, yeah, it will bring it up as soon as it starts the development server appropriately. Then you'll see this begin to paint, and we'll see our devices screen, which is the default screen. So I've got my code right here, and we're going to see this turn dark in just a minute as soon as it's done loading. There it is. And so what I wanted to show you is this. The nice thing about the way that this works is this. I'm going to say, all right, I want to change the name from Mini Quokka to Quokka Lite. So I'm going to do Quokka Lite like that. And my Quokka Lite is in bold. The way that this is different than PyCharm. PyCharm automatically saves. I have the opportunity to do auto save, but instead I'm going to manually just say save. And watch up here what happens, because up here you're going to see this reboot itself. As soon as I do save, do you see it says compiling? So it's recompiling everything. And what you'll also see is that this is going to reload, and you'll see that this went from Mini Quokka to Quokka Lite dashboard. So it's kind of handy. You make your change here, you save the file, and it automatically reboots itself. So it allows you to see kind of instantly the changes that you've made. So that's why I've done that. Now that you know that that works, I will make this a little bit bigger on either side so that we can see the code that we have. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger down here as well. All right, so you recall that we have index that refers to our dashboard, and now we're doing the 10,000 foot view. We're going to look at dashboard and look at what happens. So here you see inside these angled brackets, you see this name here, dashboard, and you say to yourself, well, what is that? It looks like an HTML tag. Well, the way that React.js works is that you will define, this is React in general. I suspect that React Native which is the React that's built for mobile devices like phones, is the same, but I frankly don't know the answer to that. So if I say React, I really mean React JS, which is this version. You will end up specifying as the tag name the component that you are referencing here. So here I'm saying I want you to load dashboard. Let me see if I can make that there. It's a little bit easier to read. I want you to load dashboard, and I want you to pass into it this thing called device name, and the device name is not going to have anything in it. Now, that may be historical as well. I don't think that I need device name. In fact, let's go look at dashboard and see what it does. So when dashboard starts up, this is its constructor, and it's actually not even taking the device name. So I should be able to go back to my dashboard, which I got to admit, oh, there's a scroll bar here. I didn't even realize that. I can scroll this way. Whoops. And sorry, I just split services over to the right. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to learn this as we go. But actually, I ended up back here at my dashboard, and I didn't want to go to the dashboard, though I wanted to go to the index. So here I am at the index, and I was saying device name is not required, so I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that. I think what you'll probably see when I do this, I'm not going to save it, so it's not going to update it, but you see it's identified that I've made a change. In fact, I don't trust myself, so I'm going to go ahead and do a save. I'm going to do Control S, which does a save. You can see it's recompiling, and when we go over and look at our output, what we'll be able to see is whether it actually worked or not, and it did work successfully. So that's good. We made one change successfully. So it's just going to load dashboard. When it loads dashboard, it's going to come in here. Now dashboard is a class, and so a lot of this stuff I'm not going to go into in great detail. This is React stuff. You can read about it if you want, but we are extending the React component class, and that means that we're going to have a constructor, and then we're going to have something called render. And render is what gets called when it's time to render that page. Our page is the dashboard, which, as I mentioned, is the entire thing. And we'll look at what it actually prints out in just a second when we look at the HTML that it returns. But this is going to be a combination of JavaScript and HTML. You see JavaScript code up here, and you see HTML stuff that we're returning. And also, guess what? This thing here in the curly brackets, that's basically a variable that we are passing into this grid. And that's in general how these things work. And what you're going to need to do when you build your own is start from something that works like this and make your modifications as you become familiar with it. You're not going to want to start from scratch writing this stuff yourself. You're going to want to start from something that you know works and is built in a way that is successful, and then you can modify it from there. So let me say a few things. Constructor, remember when you have classes in Python, we had underscore, underscore, init, underscore, underscore. That is the thing that gets called when an object is instantiated or created, and we created it back in index when we did this. So when we did this, we're basically creating a dashboard object, and so that is what is going to happen. Now, all that we're doing is we're calling our parent, and I haven't figured out why Virtual Studio Code believes that this is deprecated. Perhaps it is. I'm just following the suggestions of the React folks, so it works, so I'm not going to worry about it. Now, remember in Python, when we're referring to data that is associated with the object instance, we use the word self. In JavaScript, as well as most of the rest of the world, the way that we refer to this particular object instance is with the word this. So when I say this, it means this particular object dot, and then we give the name of a field that we're going to use. And there's a field in this called state, and state is what React and this whole functionality uses in order to know if it needs to update itself on the screen. And so what you will see us doing is we will be modifying the state. Here you see that I am modifying the state, that my state variables are devices, and my countdown value, the countdown value, as you probably guessed, is the thing that's getting printed right up here, my number of seconds. So this is telling React to update that. Now, here's the good news. When you update the state, it is not going to repaint the entire screen. That's what we're trying to get away from. It's just going to repaint the little bit that needs to be updated. So all of this stuff down here, everything else does not need to get updated. React framework is smart enough, and I believe that I'm giving React credit and that React deserves the credit. But the framework is smart enough to know it only needs to update that particular thing. So in this devices screen, there's a countdown value. So let's go back to our dashboard and look at this a little bit more. What we're doing is we're setting a variable called show. That means when we change that variable, that show variable, then it's going to do something. And let's look at render. Render is what tells the framework, this is what I want you to print on the, or paint on the screen. So all this says is we're going to call this thing called this.state, we're going to call it show. Here I'm setting the dark theme. If you're familiar with Quokka, the original Quokka, I don't use the dark theme. I just decided to use it because it matched what we did in the terminal window, and I kind of like it better. So let's look at this. What is this code actually doing? So let's look at this JavaScript code. Here I'm saying, you're familiar now with an if statement. You need to be aware that if statements vary depending on whether you are writing Python code or Java code or C code or JavaScript code. And so this JavaScript follows more of the traditional programming language way of doing things. We're going to have an if statement, and we're going to have curly brackets that surround this thing. So in other words, my indentation doesn't really matter in this whole world of JavaScript like it does, certainly not like it does in Python. Also, you'll notice that we don't have an elif keyword in JavaScript. I'm using else if. And so I'm saying if show equals devices. Another thing you're going to, and show is the thing that we set up here. And at a high level, you can see, okay, if show equals devices, I'm going to say info equals, here's that same construct that we were looking at, this angled brackets, less than, greater than sign, and I'm referencing devices here. And so that's going to be creating a devices object if I'm saying show devices. If I'm saying show hosts, then it's going to create hosts. If I'm saying show services, it's going to create services. If I look back at the user interface, if I click on devices, it's going to show me the devices. If I click on hosts, it's going to show me the hosts. If I click on services, it's going to show me the services. That's basically what this is getting at here. Now, something else to notice is I have 3 equal signs. This is a JavaScript feature of the language, which compares not only that these two values are equal, but they are of exactly the same type as well. So a lot of times your IDE will squawk at you if you use equals equals. So you'll want to be using equals equals equals, and you can learn more about that by looking into it. The last thing I want to show you, and this is the again, we're doing a high-level view, and remember what we're talking about is the dashboard, which is this entire thing. Remember that includes the top blue thing here, as well as the thing that goes below it. And the thing that goes below it is going to change depending on what I've decided to show, devices or what have you. And so here's my return statement. This return statement is going to basically tell the framework, this is what I want you to paint on the screen. And since it's the dashboard, we are telling it what the entire screen layout is going to be. And here, this grid, if I go up here and look, where does grid come from? Material UI. So this is part of the Google look and feel that I'm getting. I'm creating a grid. I'm saying my grid is a column. That means I'm going to go from top to bottom. If you look here, what's on the top? The app bar is on the top. What's the next thing? It's this devices table. If I had more things, I would add more things. So hopefully that makes sense. This grid, I'm going to have a couple of things in it. Now, in order to do a theme, I'm going to specify theme provider that says that it's the dark theme. I suspect I could have not indented this, but I did when I did it, so don't worry about that. These are the two things that are part of my grid. The first thing is going to be my dashboard app bar. Dashboard app bar is this blue thing up here at the top. The next thing in my grid is going to be, guess what? It's another grid. And this is a direction of row. It's taken up the entire thing. In Quokka, I had more stuff going on here. But for this, I only have the one thing, so this is something else I might simplify as well. There's only one thing in here. What is that thing? That's info. What is info? Well, nicely, this IDE has highlighted info for me, and it shows me that info is either going to be this component called services, which you see over here, or this component called hosts, which you see over there, or this component called devices, which you see over here as well. Now let's begin to look a little bit deeper at our two things that we're looking at, our dashboard app bar and then devices, hosts, or services. Okay, so we've looked at dashboard. Let's look at the dashboard app bar. Remember, that's the thing at the top here in blue with this wording on the left, and then these buttons over here on the right to flip between showing devices or hosts or services. And so what does that look like in code? Well, there's a couple of things. The first thing I want to show you is this right here. Do you see this? This is the thing called dashboard app bar. Now that is a little bit different. Remember when we look at dashboard, what was dashboard? Dashboard was a class. When we look at devices, devices is a class. If we look at hosts, as you might expect, it's a class, and you can take my word that services is the same as well. Why is this a function? The reason is there is no reason. There is no good reason anyway, let's say. When you develop your components in React, you can make them either functions or you can make them classes. And so in this situation, what I clearly did was I copied an example of this thing called that implements an application bar. I followed the model of doing it by somebody who had created one as a function rather than as a class. So you can mix them. I could have had devices be a class and host be a function, etc. Doesn't really matter all that much. It might to somebody who's super experienced, and you might be in an organization where they say all of our components are going to be classes or they will all be functions or whatever. But for our purposes, this just exposes you to the fact that it could be one or the other. Now let's look at the interesting part of this. Basically, the return statement. This is some HTML app bar. Where does app bar come from? That's a material UI thing. So this is coming from Google's look and feel type stuff. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail with this, but the thing that's important are these things. These are the operational pieces, these buttons. Button also is a material UI thing. It's going to do something underneath the covers, but I'm using Google's version of it. And basically what's going to happen is this. This is the way in these JavaScript type frameworks, what you end up doing is you define an HTML function, and the HTML function you specify, and this is more HTML than others, you're going to specify a JavaScript function that's going to get called when somebody clicks on it. And so when I come over here and I click on hosts, what is going to happen? And that's what this defines. When I click on the button called hosts, there, that one that's called hosts, what is actually going to happen? It's going to call my JavaScript function called render hosts. So this is the code that I have written in order to cause my hosts to get displayed. And if we wonder where's this render host come from, it's a function that I have defined, and you can see that I've done the same type of thing for render hosts, render devices, and render services. And what is it going to do? The thing that it's going to do is this. Remember when I got, no, you don't remember that because I didn't actually set that. My function called dashboard app bar, I don't have a constructor because it's not a class, but what I'm going to do is I passed in properties, and my properties, if I go back to the dashboard and I look at the point where my dashboard was actually, the dashboard app bar was created, I passed in a parameter called dashboard. This is like keyword parameters in Python, and I passed in the actual variable this. So I passed in this object. Remember, this object is my entire dashboard. So when I called dashboard app bar, this is like a function call, and I passed in a keyword parameter called this. When I go to my dashboard app bar and I look at that function, it got something called properties, and there was a property in it called the dashboard, and I set it to this value right here. This variable is now pointing at that actual object. So it's pointing at my dashboard object, okay? It's not pointing at the class, it's pointing at the actual object. And so what is going to happen? I'm going to call, in my situation, I said render hosts. I'm passing in dashboard. Now that we understand how functions and everything works, I can see, okay, render hosts, it takes a parameter called dashboard. And what is it going to do? It's going to take dashboard and it's going to set its state. It's going to set the state variable. The variable that it's going to set is show hosts. So let's go back to our dashboard. Remember, dashboard has the state. It has one variable in here called show that tells it what to display. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to modify this dashboard object, and it's going to change what this show value is. This .state.show, it's going to change it in our situation that we were looking at render host. It's going to say, it's going to set the show value to be hosts. And so what's going to happen now? So this is the magic that happens with the whole framework, with JavaScript, with front-end type stuff. When we modify this thing called state, it's going to cause it to wake up and repaint itself. When I set the show variable, this .state.show to hosts, which is what I'm doing in this particular time, it's going to come down here and it's say, hey, I need to render this. Set my show to get the show value out of the state, and then it's going to say if the show value is now set to devices, then create this devices and render it down here. If the show value is equal to host, which it is this time, remember, dashboard app bar, I set the state of show to hosts. If it's set to host, then it's going to say, I want to create this thing, this info variable that's going to point at this HTML thing called hosts, and that's my hosts object. And then when it renders it, it's going to come down here for this grid item, which is the lower thing here, the thing below the app bar, and it's going to actually render the hosts object, the host component, rather than, so it will be replacing when I'm pointing at devices. Right now I did that for devices. When I'm pointing at devices and I click on hosts, it's going to set the set state show value to hosts, and it's going to go and re-render this whole thing down here to print out the hosts information. And that in general is how this dashboard app bar, this is really the only input type thing that we've got going on where we modify what's going on this screen. This is what happens. We have a button, and we specify this onClick action to take. When that happens, what we're basically saying, you don't have to understand all of the syntax of this, but just you'll be doing this a lot, is what we're going to do is we're going to call render devices, and we're going to pass in the dashboard value, or if the person has clicked on the button hosts, then we're going to call on render hosts and pass in the dashboard. And every time with that dashboard, we're going to set its state to something different. If they did render hosts, we'll set it to host, devices, devices, services, services, and the framework is going to make sure that this is called, and it's going to render this information, and the information that it renders is going to be based on that show value that we set. It will either be devices or hosts or services, and then that info thing will be set appropriately, and it will print that out. Next, we'll look at what these actually look like, the devices, the devices and hosts and services, wherever services went. We will look at those components. Okay, this is where it gets real, and it gets real interesting. This is the host.javascript file that we're looking at for the hosts component. And just to remind you, host component is what is being used in order to render this dark grayish type thing, including these words, the countdown timer, the button that says refresh hosts, as well as all of this stuff in this data table that I can sort and do various things to. So how do we get that? Well, let's take a look at the code. Now there's going to be a lot of stuff in this code, and I'm going to touch on the most critical components for you to understand. And as is true not only with JavaScript frameworks, but also with some Python libraries and other stuff, you just kind of have to trust certain things that they work and they do what they seem to be saying that they're going to do. So let's take a quick high-level view of this class definition for hosts. I've got my constructor with hosts and my countdown value. We looked at that a little bit. Here's my countdown function. We'll look into that in just a little bit. Fetch hosts. Okay, what is that? Well, if you remember what we've been talking about, how this works, we talked about how we're serving up the user interface pages via this this thing right here, this Node.js that's running, that's providing all of the JavaScript and HTML, but the data itself is coming from our Quokka server. And I'm not going to show you, but you can trust me that the Quokka server is running in the background. I also have the monitoring processes or applications that are running in the background. So all that is going on, and I'm going to be fetching data from this server. And if I'm looking at hosts, then I'm going to be fetching host data. And so that's what I'm doing on this particular screen. So when you look at this function here called fetch hosts, you can probably imagine, oh, I'll bet you he's going out and getting hosts. And if you recall and put together in your mind what you imagine this URL will be, then you can say, yeah, you can probably even see, oh, there must be a fetch function in JavaScript that allows me to do that. And in fact, it does. And I'm going to have to go into this in a little bit of detail because it's something that you haven't really seen before, at least not in this manner. So there's going to be some fetching of host data going on. And in fact, if we look up here, what's my countdown doing? Well, if my countdown has gotten down to 0, what do? I fetch hosts. And if you look at this, probably you're thinking when this gets down to 0, that's when we get the host data and update it. And you're absolutely correct. That's exactly what we're doing. That is fetch hosts. Now, if I look here, there's a couple of things. Component did mount, component will mount. This is for interval timer type stuff, and this is just, it's not busy work, but it's stuff that you need to do when you've got a timer, countdown timer, etc. going on. So let's look at my render functionality. Remember, render is what gets called when we need to draw stuff. And so there's a number of things going on here that we can look at, and I'm not going to be able to go into all of the detail for all of this, but you can get the general idea that I'm going to have a grid. Remember we saw grid before. The grid is going to be, that is referring to the thing that is right here. This is which has the name host table, it has the countdown timer, and it has refresh hosts in it. And so that is what that is going to be. You can see the information, host table, time until refresh, and then a button that's going to be on click. I'm going to go ahead and just force myself to do fetch hosts. That should look a little bit messy, but you kind of get the general idea. Then the thing below it is basically this thing in light gray. What is that? Well, that's something called material table. Let's go up and look at our imports. You can see that material table is not imported from @material_UI, which is the Google thing. It's imported from this thing, this package that I installed that's open source called material table. It's basically a table implementation using material UI under the covers, which itself is using React, etc. The material UI really is basically just giving me the look and feel that I want. So it has more to do with the display of things than to React per se. But you get the general idea. This is built on this material UI stuff, which itself is built on top of React. And so that is what my material table is going to be. Now they have defined the way that you create and define the table. So they created, or this person who wrote this created a table that you invoke using material table component. And what's going to happen is you're going to define the title, and that's what you see at the top of this. I don't have to always keep going back, but you get basic idea. There's the title of it, and when I come down a little bit further, these are the columns. So these are the columns of my table, and you can see I have a bunch of these. Some of them are clearer than the others, so let's look at some of the easy ones. Title, IP address, field, IP address, default sort. You can kind of look at this and understand this is the textual title. This is the field that it's coming from, and I'll explain what this field thing is in a minute. Response time, there's a response time that I'm printing out. Last heard, open TCP ports. All of those things are defining what my table structure is going to be and where the data is going to come from. Now, what about that data? Where does it come from? When I say IP address or MAC address or response time, what does that come from? Well, here is the definition of where the data comes from. It's going to come from this thing called hosts. And as you might imagine, where did I get hosts? If I go up here to my fetch hosts, you can see that I'm going to be setting hosts equal to the data that I receive. We'll look at this in more detail in a minute. So when I scroll down here, then you can say my data is coming from this table of data that is called hosts. Why am I doing object.values? I don't actually do this in the actual Quokka implementation, but here I need to do object.values because hosts data is actually a dictionary of dictionaries. If you remember it from the code that we wrote from our mini Quokka, which I'm now toying with the idea of calling Quokka Lite. If you recall, the data that we pass back is actually a dictionary of dictionaries. The key, I believe, is the host name for the host table. And I don't really care about the dictionary-ness of it right now. I just want it to be a list. And if you recall, remember in Python how I can take a dictionary and in order to iterate through the values of the dictionary, I just do dictionary.values. So my dictionary name, I would say host.values. That code is in Python. If you want to look at it, you'll remember that we did that when we iterate through it in our own terminal-based display. This is the JavaScript equivalent. It's a helper function of this object object. It's the class object, and I can call this actual method called values, and that will take my dictionary and return a list of those items, of the values in the items. Now the other thing that I will point out, so we've seen the definition of the title in material table. We've seen the definition of the columns. We've seen where does the data come from. The data comes from this thing right here, and the thing over here in the fields is going to be these are actually going to be values within hosts, every host itself. And then the last thing are going to be options. I'm saying I want you to sort it. I want you to have the padding be dense. I want to have the page size be 10. And here is where I'm actually changing the color. This thing right here is telling me that this is going to be JavaScript code coming. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of this, but you can see, and maybe you can imitate it in your own versions. I'm saying if the availability is false, then I'm going to turn the color to red. If the open TCP ports are, the length is greater than 2, I'll look at that in a second. I want it to be yellow. Otherwise, I want the color to be chartreuse. Let's take a look here. You can see, I'm hoping you can see this. The ones at the top are the ones, all I've done is I've done a tricky thing and said if the length of open TCP ports is greater than 2, what would it be if it was 2? If it was 2, it would be open and close parentheses. Because it's greater than 2, I'm saying that there are something in there that I'm going to interpolate, or I'm going to infer or deduce that means there are ports. And so here you see that I have green, or this is actually light green, which is chartreuse for those that have no open ports. But for things that have more than that, and here's my red. Red was because it's not available, and then these ones are yellow. And I set my table size to 10. I can change it to 20, and if I did that, then then it would have come out with 20 of these. So you can see there's, I can barely fit 20 of them in. And that is a fairly quick, high-level overview of what I am printing out there. Now, next we're going to look at that all-important call to fetch hosts, which will actually be the same in fetch devices as well as fetch services. Okay, so now we're going to look at fetch hosts. Now, if you didn't have your thinking hat on before this, I need you to make sure you put it on right now, because I'm going to describe something to you which is fairly different than what we've dealt with before to a certain degree, but it's a little bit the same to some of the stuff that we've done in our Python definitions before. And this is a new way that a lot of software is being built, and that is using asynchronous programming. And let me describe to you basically what it is. In general, with code, what you're used to have happening is you execute this line, and then you execute that line, and then you execute that line, and then that line, and that line, etc. And you may have loops, but you basically do stuff in the prescribed order. But if you recall from Python, remember when we talked about generators? And what did generators do? A generator function would stop in the middle of what it was doing, and it would do something called yield, which meant that it would give up control until a later point in time. That later point in time would be when it got called the next time in order to go through some iterative type process. This is something similar, where what we're going to do is we are going to begin to do something, and then we're going to go away. And the assumption is that at some later point in time, whatever it is that we were waiting for, that event is going to occur, and at that point we resume. And in this situation, that's what's going to happen. So let's look at this first. This is pretty straightforward. All I'm doing is I'm saying request URL equals, and this is something that I'm passing in my, where is that stored? I think it's in .env. This is my React app. Oh yeah, I guess I could have told that by looking right there. .env. React app quokka host, that's a constant that I've put in .env, and that is the beginning of where my quokka server is, my mini quokka or quokka lite. And then the URL piece that I'm going to be getting is /hosts. So I've created our mini quokka so that it responds to requests on /hosts. And if you're doing a get, then it will give you the things back. And in our situation, we're going to be doing a get. That's what we're doing by default. That is our URL. This let keyword, you'll see this is a JavaScript thing, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail with that, but you need to define your variables in that way quite often. Now what we're going to do is we're going to call into this function in JavaScript called fetch, and the parameter we're passing is that URL. And then we're going away. And the agreement, or the way that this works, is that we're going to go away until this completes. In other words, until this IO operation is complete. And when it's complete, that's what happens when we do this ... then. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the result that we get back and we're going to extract the JSON data from it. All right, that's what that is telling us, and I'm not going to go into tons of detail. And then with that JSON data, what we're going to do is we're going to call it data, and we are going to log it. That's the first thing that we're going to do. Then we're going to take that data and we're going to set state so that hosts, the hosts variable or field or component of the state is going to be set to that data that we got back from that request. That's what this is saying. And then because we're doing this countdown, we're going to set our countdown to the refresh rate, which is set to 60 right now. So we're resetting our countdown value. And if we have an error, then we're going to just log it and print this out. So that is what is happening here. Remember, the set state operation, that's the thing that is going to cause my React framework to repaint the screen. That means when I've completed this fetch and I've set hosts equal to that data, then it's going to go about doing this render functionality. And this render functionality, as we saw, it's going to do the thing at the top. And then the most important thing, of course, is this material table, of which this thing called hosts, that's the important component. Remember, I don't have to call it this.state.host because right here, this is the syntax for saying I want a constant and I want you to extract hosts from this.state, and I'm going to call it just hosts within this code. And that is how we get this data written out, and how we gather the data from fetch hosts, how we have this asynchronous function that doesn't wait until it returns, but it's asynchronous. It's a little bit like async IO. We fire off the request and then we go back and go on our merry way until we get the response back. And when we get the response back, that's when we do the then and the other .then. And at that point, we are pretty much good to go. So now you have a general idea of how all of this stuff works. We've talked a little bit about how we did the dashboard and how that has two components to it, the thing at the top and then the thing underneath it, the thing up here and then the thing underneath it. And then we looked at the dashboard app bar and how that's implemented. That's the thing up here at the top with these things that allow us to do devices and services as well as hosts. And I suspect hosts has gone back to 10 rows because that's the default. And then we looked from dashboard app bar, we looked at hosts to see how this stuff actually gets rendered. Obviously, there's a lot more stuff in here. You can read up about material table for the different things that you can do with it and how you get the data and how you present the data and how you can, with JSX, which is what we're using with React, we're able to do a combination of JavaScript as well as as well as HTML. Here's the last thing I'll mention. For this availability, I've got the availability. You notice that I'm printing a symbol over here under status. Basically what I'm doing is I've got this JavaScript code in here for status, and I basically check my availability. Row data is the particular row that I'm on. That is a material UI thing. From the host data, I look at the availability and I set it. This is a conditional assignment. If it is going to be true, then I set it to this value, the color green, and I use the check circle icon. And if it's false, then I use the cancel icon and I set it to the color red, and that's what you see right here. Let's see, and status, I have special sorting in order to do that. You can see there's my cancel button and there's my good ones. Okay, this has been a long lesson. I'll do a review after this, but hopefully this makes at least some sense and gets you started down the road to understanding how to do a user interface. And when I tell you this is pretty much as bare bones simple as I could make it in order to create this functionality, I'm not kidding. That definitely was my intention, and I'm hoping that I exceeded at least in part in making it understandable for you. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what we talked about in this lesson. First, I mentioned that I am not an expert at this. I'm new at it like you, and so hopefully that helps me to be able to explain it to you in a reasonable manner, since we're both a little bit in the same boat. We talked about how first you start off with this index JavaScript file. We mentioned these tags that have a special name in it. This is going to be a component that's part of React that has been defined. So we know that there's this thing called dashboard. When we go down to dashboard, we can look and see that it is a class and that it actually is going to have an app bar, as well as this other info thing that gets printed below it. And so what gets printed below it or displayed or painted below it is going to depend on whether we're asked to show devices, hosts, or services. If I remind you of this, then basically when I click on one of these things from the app bar, it's going to display something different. And so that's the mechanism by which that happens. We looked at the dashboard app bar, which is the thing up here at the top with the buttons. That's the main identifiable characteristic, is these buttons. There are methods associated with the button for when the user clicks on it. We're going to call render services, render hosts, or render devices. Those are functions I've defined. And basically what I'm doing, if you recall, I got passed in the dashboard. That is the outer thing. And we're changing the state of the dashboard, which is this entire thing, to change what it will show. So we set that. And when we do that, then basically what's going to happen is the React framework is going to come reevaluate this, see that show is either devices, hosts, or services, and it will then print it out. So once it is printing it out, what is it printing? Well, it's going to either display devices or hosts or services. So we looked a little bit at these to see what it is that they do. There's a number of interesting things in here. We looked a little bit at the countdown that changes that countdown value that you see up here. We looked at fetch host, which is a really important thing. This is an example of what we talked about, where the pages, the JavaScript and HTML, are getting served by this thing that's running right here, this service. And then the actual data, that is the stuff that goes inside this table, is coming from the Quokka server. And that's the Flask implementation that we have that has certain endpoints defined that return the data that we're talking about. So that is what the fetch host thing is all about. We talked about render in all of these, and how render is the thing that gets called to render the data, that it's smart enough only to paint what is necessary to be painted, so it doesn't repaint the entire thing. We talked about how at the top of that there's going to be something that says what type of table this is, the discovered host with availability, TCP ports, etc. There's also this title of the table. The material table is the thing that has this portion on it. and then the data is what comes inside of it. And so the data is actually this material table. We talked about how the material table has a title, like I just mentioned. It also has columns, which we express what the title of the column is, how to render it if it's necessary to do something special, how to sort it if you have to do something special there. There are simpler ones where the title is just a string that we give it, and the field, which is the data, it comes actually from the thing that we're going to talk about in a second. And yeah, the data actually for this table, remember I'm within material table here, so the data that we're looking at is going to be hosts. The reason that I have object.values is because I have to turn hosts from being a dictionary of dictionaries into a list of dictionaries. And then there's a bunch of options. This is where I figure out whether to color it red, yellow, or bright green. So that in general is what we learned. Hopefully that makes sense to you and you have a better idea what all is going on. This is a very simple implementation. There's a lot of stuff going on, and there's stuff that you and I don't even understand, like the code that's behind material table and behind Google's grid and all this other stuff. But that's the way that a lot of these things work these days. There's open source that's contributed, and you don't exactly know how it was done, but you make use of it because it makes your output in our situation be way richer than it would have otherwise. Hopefully that makes sense to you and you have a better understanding of how to do real live user interfaces with a browser-based front end. As always, if you have questions, let me know. And until next time, thanks for listening.